morning, everyone. Everyone hear me okay? So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. We all come from different backgrounds, but we all share the same space. It's a pretty remarkable space that is no longer a niche business to inhabit. It used to be 15, 20 years ago, it was 5 of us in a corner geeking out about these kinds of things, and now it's become mainstream. There are blogs and websites. How's that? Okay. So it's great that we can all participate in something that is now mainstream. It's cool to celebrate the urban environment. It's cool to celebrate the local, and these things are really working to our advantage. There's always an uphill battle. It's a competition, but we do have some market forces that are working in our favor. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you all and the esteemed colleagues who are sharing this space with me today, Jennifer, who preceded me, and some of the others that are leading the workshops this afternoon. So just a quick backgrounder on me. As Tina said, my background is retail. I come from both a design and development background as well as leasing and brokerage. So I'm actively involved in the beginning and the end of the process. Our company at Street Sense in Washington is a multidisciplinary agency that specializes in retail, food and beverage, and hospitality. And that encompasses everything from strategy and urban planning at the beginning, all the way through leasing at the end. So it also includes landscape design, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting to advance these slides. Thank you. Real estate strategy and planning, public space design, architecture and storefront design. We do a lot of work with grocery stores, markets, and emerging food halls. We do restaurant design, fast casual cafes. We do food and beverage concepting. We work with mom and pops. If you make a great scrambled egg, we can help you turn it into a business. We even design the packaging, the uniforms that employees wear. We do a lot of hospitality consulting. So we design hotels, but we also come up with the vision, the character for the lobby experience. We do uniforms for the employees and craft the pitch for employees to give to guests. And so it's really a holistic approach to what we do. We immerse ourselves in the experience on behalf of our clients, and everything that happens in the middle with the create means that all 150 of us, with all of these different backgrounds, share the same space, just like I am with you. We all work together, and it makes for a much more efficient process, and I like to think that the end result is a lot more educated and informed. It means that our architects are more intelligent when it comes to retail leasing. They're not designing triangular spaces with 5-foot ceilings. And it means that our brokers have a better understanding as to the importance of good design. So today, this morning, I'm going to be talking just a little bit about the state of retail, where we are today, where we've come from. Retail fundamentals, which is a particular passion of mine. Jennifer was kind enough to cover a lot of them, so I'll skim through quickly. And then get into the business side, the mind of the retailer and the mind of the landlord. It's important in creating a successful end-use environment for retailers that we understand the mechanics of getting transactions done. This is a partnership, especially when we're dealing with independent retailers. It's a partnership between the landlord and the tenant. It's important to marry those two together and get that right so it's a successful marriage for both. Just like real estate is a permanent or a semi-permanent product, leases and the investment that goes on between the retailer and even the landlord to an extent are significant. We've got to get these things right today so that we're not trying to repair them soon down the road. So the state of retail, this is the global retail picture. As you can see, the United States has far more retail per capita than any other country in the world, double what Canada has. All North American cities are over-retailed. It's largely because of the suburbs. As you can see, the countries that are lower on the list here tend to be more urban in nature. And it was really the proliferation of the automobile that led to a lower efficiency quotient when it came to retail development and performance. I think you'll start to see that change as our Class B and Class C malls die and are repositioned into mixed-use environments with far less but right-sized retail. So I think these numbers will come down, but we are certainly over-retailed. We're also seeing a growth in e-commerce. Today, it's led by commodities. People are getting their dog food, their toilet paper. But experiential retail is as popular now as ever. So while we'll probably see e-commerce continue to grow with the advent, the improvement of technology, the continued focus, the increasing focus on experiential retail, my prediction, will keep that growth to a relatively moderate level. 100 years of retail in North America. It started with the urban centers and rural retail. With the advent of the automobile and the proliferation of the suburbs, the shopping malls took over. And while American cities suffered drastic exodus, Canadian cities, the urban environment also suffered at the expense of suburban growth and the shopping mall. And as we entered the 90s, the focus on the urban realm started to come back into the foray, and it's now become mainstream. The mall is dead, the power centers are dying, and lifestyle mixed use in urban cores and urban neighborhoods are back on the rebound. So some post-2008 trends. It was really 2008 that marked a significant change in the retail landscape, and part of that was accentuated by the fact that suburban retailers had a complete rethinking of their approach. Before the crash, retailers were overexpanding. Their strategy was driven by investors who were looking for short-term returns in exchange for very poor long-term results. And as a result, the chains have turned their attention to urban environments as a way to find new opportunities for growth. Suburban growth by the national chain has slowed significantly, and we're starting to see national chains close, contract, or drastically reduce their expansion strategies and reprioritize their efforts. We're also seeing a lot of national chains turn their efforts overseas to the Middle East and Asia, where shopping patterns haven't changed quite as much. As I said before, lifestyle has become paramount, and that is getting more and more significant as the millennial generation gets older and older. We are spending more and more these days on our living. Our cost of living has not kept pace or has outpaced the growth of income. Therefore, we don't have as much money to spend on things that we used to. Millennials are prioritizing their expenditures differently, and that's led by food and beverage. It's led by experiential retail. So food and beverage is exploding. Neighborhood fitness, these boutique little fitness centers are really driving the growth of our neighborhood streets. It's a really great thing that we're seeing. Apparel is growing, but slowly. Independent apparel is growing at a more rapid pace than it used to. Home furnishings is expanding only selectively. Big box retailers are contracting. And local entrepreneurship is expanding at a rapid pace. So let's talk about the local, and let's talk about why we like and love, appreciate, and celebrate the locals. Why are we here today? Well, if you're a consumer, you love the local because they're authentic, they're vibrant, they're unique, they're innovative, they change their practices to meet your needs. When you walk in that store, your store owner, your baker, they know your name, they know what you want, and that's really a really special experience. If you're a landlord and you get it, then the expanded customer segment, the value that locals can drive to a property, because they're different, because they're unique, because they offer something the national chain doesn't, can be a real value. At the end of the day, it's all about sales. Rent is a function of sales. If you're generating sales, then you have the ability to pay the rent. And landlords, if they get it, they see that. And the top local retailers, there is an increasing precedent, and this is one of my primary roles, and what I do is to convince developers, both big and small, that independents drive a value in a way that chains don't. Independents can outperform and outlast national chains. Keep those coming, please. If you're a community, there are also a lot of tangible and intangibles. When you support local commerce, you're not only investing in that retailer, but they're investing in their vendors who tend to be locals. Local retail tends to reinvest their dollars back into the community at a rate of 4 to 5 times that of a national chain. And as a result, we talk about the imbalance of wealth and gentrification, but by buying local, you're spreading wealth, you're redistributing wealth, and that's a good thing. There are challenges. We live in a very competitive world. There are a lot of landlords out there who still don't get it. So let's think about this if you're a retailer. If I have a great bakery that everyone loves and you're a landlord and you're chasing me, well, the first thing that I need to do as a baker is, where do I find the time? I've got to get up at 4 in the morning and start making my product. I have a business to operate. I have a family back at home. I don't have time to find a new site, design a new store, and ultimately operate 2 stores or more. So I also need the ability to raise capital for startup and for operating. How do I do that? I've never done that before. That's a big undertaking. I don't have the capacities that a national chain does. I don't have the expertise in negotiating a lease that is tenant favorable. I don't have any experience in building a store. My cost of goods are out of whack with what national chains get. Vendors tend to offer goods at a lower cost per unit to those who buy at higher quantities. They also have a thing called clearance. National chains give preferential treatment to retailers who buy more from them, which means as a small independent with 1 store, you don't have the access to the same goods. Staffing, it's a hassle, hiring and then also competing with national chains when it comes to compensation and benefits. And then understanding merchandising and display. There are great locals out there. I've worked with many. Our company works with mom and pops all the time. And just because you make that great scrambled egg I talk about doesn't mean that you have the expertise to sell it on a retail level. So the art of merchandising is a big one. I'm sure we've all seen that muffin, that standalone muffin with crumbs surrounding on the tray and the case. It never gets sold. You might think that the guy behind you is buying it, and it never gets sold. So there is an art to merchandising. Abundance is key. I'm not suggesting that people prepare a lot of product and throw it out. But my advice is that if you make those muffins, you'll sell those muffins. And there is an art to merchandising that not all mom and pops get from the day that they enter the business world. If you're a landlord, there are a lot of challenges, and it's my job to get landlords over those hurdles. There's that reduced capital that I talked about. There's what we call credit, collateral. A tenant needs to put up some collateral in the event, God forbid, that their business doesn't make it. That landlord has likely invested some money in the space. They're out rent that they weren't planning on being out. And so the tenant needs to come up with some collateral to help mitigate any sort of inconveniences or downturns. Lease negotiations can be a challenge with locals, and for obvious reasons. It's time and it's experience. The permitting, the construction, the tolerance to pay rent. There's it's a majority of developers will say, well, locals don't pay as much rent. I could spend hours with you talking to you about the, thank you. Talking to you about how we can overcome those things, but they're not without their challenges. And then there's the tolerance for economic swings. National chains tend to weather economic swings more easily than independents, and for obvious reasons. So let's just talk about what we can do to overcome those things. If you're a great baker, focus on what you need to do and what you need to know, and hire the experts to help you through these things. Hire a broker to help you find the right site and negotiate the right transaction. Hire an attorney to help you negotiate that lease. Hire a permit expediter to help you get those plans approved so you can start construction, get open for business. Prepare that solid business plan so that you know that your concept is one that's viable in the market that your broker has suggested you pursue. Raise enough capital to open for business and operate at a short-term loss. And avoid those personal guarantees. I know that there are a number of retailers in there. Personal guarantees are a way of providing that collateral I talked about. Life's too short to put your house and your family on the line. There are ways to get around guaranteeing the term of your lease with your house. So avoid those personal guarantees that landlords will sometimes seek out. I advise them it's not worth the hassle. From an operations standpoint, do what you do best, but try to operate at a certain level of standard that's consistent with the national chain. National chains do a lot of things wrong. There's some things that they do right. They're open whenever we want them to be. They always have that product that we covet. You can do those same things. If you're a coffee operator and Starbucks is across the street and you're opening 2 hours later, well, Starbucks is getting 2 hours of what is your peak business. So think about ways to compete on operations level with the national chains. Speed of service, payment, point of payment. Customers will only sacrifice so much before they move on to other opportunities. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make here. And as a way to overcompensate, or not overcompensate, compensate for some of those potential shortcomings, offer services that national chains never could or never would. Talk about millennials for a little bit. I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about millennials. They're the talk of the town, but they're a very real influence and a very important part, an increasingly important part of the business. Age is about 18 to 35, 25% of the population. They're now, as of this year, the leading segment in our workforce. They're not the decision makers yet, but they will be soon. They're slow to marry. They're slower to have children. They're having fewer children. They prefer experience over commodity. They prefer, which means they're brand aware. They're not brand loyal, they're brand aware. And they prefer employers and brands that share their beliefs. And they're quick to change. They're quick to change employers. They're quick to move. 40% of them identify as city people, and that's changing. It's increasing. As those 18-year-olds get older, more and more of them will be city people. They prefer, 65% presently prefer truly mixed-use environments. They like to live above where they shop and they eat. They like to work above where they shop and they eat. The big question is, will they age to become the boomers? Will their shopping patterns change as they have kids and as they get older? Will they move to slightly less urban locations in favor of conveniences that they might see as a result of having children? In the States where I live, we've got a big issue with inner city schools, and so there's a huge question mark as to whether or not these millennials will exit for free public education or if they'll stay and fight the good fight. So retail fundamentals, it's a big passion of mine. We've got thousands of years of retail patterns, and yet we continually make mistakes when it comes to retail design and merchandising and leasing. We need to respect those things. This is about mitigating risks. I'm not here to talk to you about finding a needle in the haystack. I'm sure that there are some cool retailers out there with 4-foot ceilings. It's not the norm. It's not something to plan for. The odds are it will fail. So it's important to minimize those risks with strong fundamentals. Get as many of them as you can right. Long-term considerations are important. Retail is a permanent investment. It's very expensive to retrofit spaces to change uses. So if you think that retail is going to be the end use, if you think that food and beverage is going to be the end use 15 years from now, you might want to consider maximizing the flexibility of the space so that it's well suited to whatever you have in the long term. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with developers who 10 years ago wished they'd installed that kitchen exhaust or right-sized the space in a different way so that it's more valuable today, more leasable. Always remember the series of elements that go into the fundamentals. You've got the physical, which is the size of the space, the ceiling height, the scale, the operational, where am I loading, where am I taking out my trash. Your customers don't want to see you dragging trash out in front of them in the middle of the day. You have a beautiful outdoor patio up front. Those garbage bags always leak. So think about where you're going to take that trash and how you're going to get it to where it needs to go without negatively impacting your customers and the environment. The economics, make sure that the rent is consistent. The rent that you're looking for in your performance consistent with the sales that you believe the tenant type you're going after can generate. Make sure that what you're offering is consistent with the demographic that you believe you're going to be pulling into the project. And if you're going to mix uses, understand what works with what. And if you're willing to put up with the challenges of mixed use, and I highly encourage that you do, just understand what works and try to figure out what or how to make the most of it so that they're not overly negatively impacting one another. So back to so the environment of the environmental part of fundamentals is really important. Jennifer spent a lot of time talking about outside the building envelope, so from building face to building face. Strong retail streets are double-sided. The farther apart storefronts become, the less synergy between the two, the less drawing appeal, the less significance that retail district has. Building scale is key. She spent a lot of time talking about Brooklyn, and she's absolutely right. The taller buildings get, the lower buildings get, the more you fall out of that ideal part of the spectrum. Retail adjacencies and continuity is really important. The more gaps in the retail frontage you have, the weaker your street environment becomes. People are less likely to make that extra step to the next retailer or the next restaurant. It's all about this continuous experience. Avoid those arcade conditions that I see so often in Toronto. There are plenty of great arcades around the world, but more often than not, they have a very, very poor track record of supporting branding identity for retailers. Those big pillars that stand out front, they block retailer identity. It's very difficult to see from the street to the storefront. They're not usually very comfortable spaces to walk under. I get the practical nature of covering part of the sidewalk, but there are plenty of great examples of cold climates, New York, Chicago, Boston, where the arcade condition is not the prevalent form of the built retail podium, and they're very successful. So I encourage you all, if you can, to avoid those retail podiums. I'm sorry, retail arcades. An arcade? Oh, it's when your storefront is set back from the base column of the building. So sometimes they're used to create extra sidewalk space. Sometimes the idea is to create a covered space from weather or shade. There's a tremendous amount of new construction throughout Toronto, especially high-rise buildings, where you see these arcade-covered conditions. Make sure that the building has a strong retail presence, and that ties into the arcade condition I talk about. Make sure that your streets are safe. Toronto's a very safe city, but perception is just as important as reality. If the reality is that your street is safe, if it's not perceived to be, if it's not clean and well-maintained, if people are uncomfortable, you're really reducing your potential customer base. So perception is just as important as reality. And then we get inside the space. So as I said before, retailers have to be able to operate efficiently. They're not going to pay rent on space that they can't effectively generate sales in. So make sure that the geometry of the space is conducive to retail operations. Rectilinear is ideal. Shallow space is not efficient for retailers. Restaurants have to put kitchens somewhere, and you don't want them up along the storefront, wasting frontage and negatively impacting the experience of the space. Ceiling heights have to be right. They've got to be conducive. They have to be comfortable to the customer, and efficient for the operator. The tenant needs to be able to express their brand through signage and storefront identity, and make sure that the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, and the kitchen exhaust is sized properly for retail. It's very expensive to correct later, and if you never correct it, then it means you'll always be limited in terms of the offerings that you can provide. And make sure that you get the loading and the trash right. Let's talk about process. So first is the vision. So as I said, we're all in this together. So if you're the community, what is the purpose of the retail that you're trying to encourage in your district or on your street? Is it to give your neighborhood an identity? Is it to provide an amenity for your neighborhood residents? Is it to generate tax revenue? It might be all of the above. It might only be one of them. If you're a landlord, is the idea that you're looking for a self-sustaining retail asset, no different from a suburban strip mall where you have a retail asset that needs to generate you a specific return. Is the idea that it needs to generate a certain amenity for your residential or office space above, which might help you to attract more tenants. Taking that one step further is the idea to drive value to non-retail uses above. Are you looking for a retailer that's going to create an identity for your building that helps you actually increase rents on your office space or your residential space above? Perhaps even in exchange for a slightly lower rent just to get that right retailer in the ground floor. We call that vertical co-tenancy. It's a big part of our business. We deal with a lot of developers who are looking for very cool environments and tenants that they see their peers putting into their buildings, and it's a very legitimate and viable way of looking at your real estate development on a holistic basis. And then there are two others. One is just to fill ground floor space. Quality, not quantity. There's no point in building retail space that is inefficient and unable to sustain retail on a consistent basis. You want to avoid turnover and vacancy. Don't build it if you can't keep it leased. We have a hierarchy of streets here. Not all of them are intended to have retail, and that's okay. Focus your energy on your retail streets and keep the residential and the non-retail uses for non-retail streets. And then there's ego. Ego drives a lot of retail, unfortunately. It rarely comes with any sort of success for landlords, so avoid the ego quotient. Always remember that retail is commerce. At the end of the day, if it's not working for the landlord and it's not working for the tenant, it's going to be short-lived. It's not working. It's a broken process. So just remember that at the end of the day, everyone has to make money. And let's talk about roles here. It's the city's job to steer, and Jennifer was talking about policy and guiding these streets in the way we want them to to end up, and policy is a very important part of what we do. At the end of the day, it is the landlord who is filling those spaces. It's not the mayor who decides where McDonald's goes. We can start to shape the direction of our streets, but only to a certain level. It's my job as a consultant to try to encourage these developers to go in another direction that benefits all of us. Next is the market. Understand the market. Know where it is today, know where it is in the future. Data is becoming an increasingly large part of what we do in real estate. It's more sophisticated, it's more readily available. Use it whenever you can, whether you're a developer or a tenant, or a municipality for that matter. Gut is the exception, data is the norm. But it is important to note that some of the most celebrated things that we see out there in our urban environments were done so because somebody in their gut felt that it would be a transformative undertaking. Gut typically overcomes data in situations where a neighborhood is in transformation, where it is still very difficult to project data and the degree of change that you otherwise see in a more static environment. Gut also overcomes situations where you feel that your product, whether it is a store, a building, or even a neighborhood, neighborhoods compete with other neighborhoods for retailers. If you feel that you have what it takes and can put on the table what it takes to beat out your competition, those are the two most prevalent ways or instances where gut overcomes the data. Recognize where your neighborhood is in its cycle. Neighborhoods evolve. Neighborhoods, they grow. They start out slowly, and the transformation can occur exponentially. But if you want to open a restaurant, an upscale restaurant in a neighborhood that's predominantly residential in nature, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to generate enough lunch business to survive. So understand where your neighborhood is in its life cycle. Also understand where the economy is in its cycle. Timing is everything in real estate. If you've heard that location is the most important, timing isn't far behind. Understand your competition. It's constantly changing, and as I said, competition could be the building next door. It could be the neighborhood a kilometer away. Understand your strengths and your weaknesses. Is your site strong? What makes it stronger than its competition? What makes it retail conducive? And the same goes for your building itself. It's also important to note that silver bullets, they don't exist. So when we started to look at our urban cores in the 80s and 90s and find ways that we could bring new blood to them, we looked at entertainment-based or culturally oriented silver bullets that would somehow overnight change the good fortunes of our city, and it just doesn't work that way. And if there is any success, it's usually short-lived. This is a slow race. It's not a race. Time travels more quickly than we actually think. It's all about patience. The most unique and authentic things happen over time. It's important to have a strategy. So you think about all of us in a room. We all work together. We're all part of the same experience, and sometimes we share the same room and work on the same projects. So it's important to think things through, develop a consensus, and then stick to it. So the planners, the architects, the engineers, the retailers themselves, those who end up leasing it and then managing it when it's in operations mode. Make sure that you're all part of the same vision. Otherwise, the end result will get diluted. It's important to remember public space programming. That connection with the community is so important. We're going to build these public spaces. Well, how are we going to program them? Be careful when value engineering. I like this picture a lot because it has a lot of texture. Notice the ground plane, notice the detail in the building facade, the overhead lighting. When you start to strip these things away, you really start to strip away the experience. High quality design doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It just means you've got to have the right talent at the table. So I strongly encourage you to think twice before value engineering too much, because it can mean the end or the difference between success and failure. And on that note, listen to landlords and developers. They are the ones who are conducting the business. They have to live it and breathe it day to day and pay their bills, pay the mortgage. But encourage them to be at their best. As developers, we get lazy from time to time, and it's important to keep them on their toes and remind them of what makes these environments so exciting in the first place. And that's where public-private partnerships come into play. Very big part of Emerging Streets and the Vibrant Streets initiative. The BIAs, they're there to set the stage and then let the market take over. 20, 30 years ago, we spent a lot of time focusing on replacing our sidewalks with brick pavers and investing in fancy light poles. And they didn't have the returns that we all thought they would. I think we've all come to the conclusion that some edge is okay. Safety and cleanliness and maintenance is important, but a little edge and a little grit is okay. So I encourage people to focus their resources on keeping spaces and places programmed and filled. And for example, encouraging pop-up stores in vacant spaces. Work with landlords to get those spaces filled. And as I say in this last point, fake it till you make it. People are looking for smiling faces. They're looking for people walking the sidewalks. These things often tend to be, they become these self-fulfilling prophecies. I call it exponential renaissance. If you get 5 people on a street who are smiling and having a good time and they're spreading the word, each of them shares that experience and leads to another 5, and it becomes this exponential snowballing effect. So really fake it until you make it, and I've seen it work in a lot of places, and I think it's something we should all practice and celebrate and embrace our places. Keep those spaces active as often as you can. Non-retail ground floor is okay. It's preferred over vacant space, but keep it to a minimum. Once you start to get over 10%, you start to encourage a very unhealthy retail environment. So the ground floor doctor's office, the ground floor insurance agent, those are actually businesses that used to occupy our main streets, but within reason, within moderation. We've worked with a number of jurisdictions where we're paired with landlords and retailers to design spaces where that doctor's office on the ground floor isn't turning its back to the street. The insurance agent has his or her desk facing the storefront. These are ways for non-retail businesses to engage the street, engage the public, generate foot traffic that might not otherwise be walking your streets at times of the day that might not otherwise be busy. Mixed use, I talked about before. It's highly encourage it. The more people, the more uses you get into a space, the more energy you have throughout the day, the week, and the year for that matter. Mixed use environments tend to be busier at all times of the year, regardless of the weather, at all times of the day, regardless of who's doing what, who's at work, and who's at home. So encourage that layering of experiences to maximize the energy and a given experience for any one person visiting that given space. Give them as many reasons to come to your district, to your street, to your project as you can. The more you layer the experiences, the more appealing and attractive it is to potential customers. It's important to respect the challenges that come with mixed-use retail. 30 years ago, people were questioning whether or not we could go back to residential over restaurant. We can. We know how to do it. But make sure that when you build your buildings that you put in the right systems to accommodate for those mixes. Critical mass, Jennifer was talking about it. It's a big part of retail. Critical mass doesn't mean that you have to have a tremendous amount of retail. This is scalable. But what retail needs is it needs synergy. It needs destination appeal. So depending on the size of your market, that could be 4 retailers occupying 4 corners. It's also the number of uses. So the more mixed in nature your neighborhood is with regard to retail and non-retail uses, that counts as critical mass. And it's not just the amount of retail square footage, it's the number of tenants. Jennifer pointed to this growing issue with large buildings, large projects that are allocating large swaths of retail space to single tenants. The number of tenants that you have on that ground floor is key to a vibrant street. They also generate a lot more rent. Small tenants generate more rent per foot than large tenants. These are all things to think about when adding validity to the idea of going in a different direction. And collectively, these determine the degree of utility for your street. It sounds like a pretty boring result, but when you pair that with good design, you're maximizing experience. That's when you get to these spaces that we all aspire to. At the end of the day, a street or a neighborhood is only as good as its tenants, and that's where these locals come into play. So first, meet the community needs. If you meet the community needs, you've fulfilled your role, and anything beyond that is gravy. If you're really great and you generate a buzz, you'll draw from well beyond the confines of your neighborhood, but focus on your immediate needs first, and that's your surrounding resident. Maximize your appeal and draw by encouraging a variety of retailers that are both destination and daily service so that you're keeping your spaces busy all day long. Quality, authenticity, and uniqueness. That's how you're going to maximize your draw and appeal beyond the immediate neighborhood. Niche uses require a lot of density. So the knife sharpener, the pickle shop, they're all really cool and trendy, but at the end of the day, they've got to generate sales, and these require a lot of foot traffic. So if you're going to entertain these uses, it better be in a high-density neighborhood. Otherwise, these are going to be short-lived tenants, unless they're not paying any rent. At the end of the day, if the tenant dies, the street dies. Turnover and vacancy, chronic vacancy, is really bad at creating stigma. Retailers are always looking for neighborhoods where they feel that they can generate business. And if there is a track record of closures, if one space or a series of spaces are chronically vacant, the stigma associated with that is much greater than even a pioneering neighborhood where there is no track record. So back to the local movement, I talked about the local retailer, the local resident. These are the people that you want to go after every day. This is your number one customer. This is your day-to-day customer and your supporter. And if you get them behind you, if you get them proud of you and to embrace what you're doing, then they'll be your number one customer and your number one marketing tool. They will help you to become a brand. And that's what great neighborhoods are. They're brands, whether it's official or if it's passive. So your goal should be for those who have been to your retail street, whether they live there or not, to be itching to come back. And for those who haven't been, to be dying to go there because they've heard so much about it, they've read so much about it, they've seen pictures of this great space. If the locals embrace it, everyone else will follow. Public space programming is a big part of connecting with the local community. It's a way of getting locals and even out-of-neighborhood residents to your site on occasions that they wouldn't otherwise go. And if they're not immediately generating new business by attending that event, then at least they're getting into the habit of going somewhere. They are, you're forging a relationship with them. You're getting them to believe in what you're doing. It's a really great way. I call it the third tenant. So we have permanent tenants, temporary tenants, the pop-up stores. And public space programming is the third tenant. It's the third reason for anyone, whether they're local or outside of the jurisdiction, to want to be there. The goal should be to be photographed, to be talked about. Buzz is a big, big player in the success of retail today, thanks very much to social networking. This is the last part of the process, and that's vision maintenance, vision management. Understand why you got to where you were. Don't lose sight of that. If you were popular because you had a great selection of locals, then don't abandon those locals in favor of national chains that would otherwise dilute the experience and abandon the customer base. We've seen a lot of projects do that over the years. Retail should age gracefully. It should not decline. And to do that, landlords should hire property managers who get it, who understand the vision. BIA should hire people who understand what makes the neighborhood great. Respect your tenant. You want a strong relationship with a tenant, not a combative one. Stay true to those fundamentals. Don't get greedy. You're never too good for those fundamentals. Competition is always on the horizon. Your retailers and your customers are always looking for the next best thing. If you're a municipality, your job is to nurture growth. So be strong, but be flexible when it comes to design regulation. Employ a pro-business environment, and encourage local investment, whether you're a landlord or if it's for a landlord or a retailer. It's important to understand the retail transaction. Very simply put, your sales potential minus your actual sales represents your retail demand. So we have various categories of retail. They're all very important to a vibrant street. And you have different classes of retail. These classes of retail, there's no one that's better than the other. Luxury retail is no better than discount retail. But the point is that classes of retail like to be near their peers because doing so creates a destination environment, and that's why you rarely see luxury retailers lining up on streets where there are not other luxury retailers. There's a power of the pack. They operate in numbers. I'm going to skip over this. I've talked about this one enough. So from a site selection standpoint, it's important to know where your demand is, where it's coming from. How do you see yourself and how do you operate on the geographic landscape? Yes, this is a map of Washington, D.C., but the fundamentals are the same. So the trade area for a daily use, like a dry cleaner, is very small. They're doing a lot of transactions. They appeal to a very, very confined customer space. Your weekly transactions are more of a medium size. Your grocery store, they trade on a wider radius than the daily, than the dry cleaners. And then the monthly would be your destination goods, your home furnishings, your apparel, your special gifts. And as you can see, it's a much larger trade area, and there are fewer of those destinations throughout the region. And this is important to remember when you're seeking out specific uses. There's only so much demand for so many grocery stores. A lot of daily, not as much medium, and even fewer regional destination. And then when you look at the geography of site selection and how geography creates these trade areas into not concentric circles, but rather custom-driven retail trade areas. So you get municipal boundaries where taxing policy can influence site selection. You get bodies of water, highways, parks, and preserves. And all of these form to create some pretty, not so obvious until you lay them out on a map, barriers that generate these custom trade areas. And you end up with very distinct trade areas that retailers look for. And this applies to nationals and mom and pops. Like I said, neighborhoods compete with one another. Locals are looking for the neighborhoods that they believe they'll thrive in. And we're entering a very
just a simple question. There was a bullet point that caught my attention that you didn't speak to. It said simply, rooftops follow retail.
Mm-hmm.
Could you
thank you.
Explain that?
Yes. So when you get out of the cores tend to be very, very mixed in nature. You have a lot of residential and you have a lot of office space. In the States, we actually have a very unbalanced in so many cities. Cities like Houston, very high on office employees and very low on residential in the core. So retailers do tend to follow rooftops. The more residents in a jurisdiction, the more viable retail is, and that points to Jennifer's comment about density. Residents tend to spend their money on weeknights because they're at work, usually during the day. Not everyone, of course, but the masses are. And on weekends. Office workers who work generally 9 to 5, 8 to 5 on a weekday, they're the ones who fuel businesses during the day. So if you're a residential neighborhood, the amount of daytime traffic, foot traffic that you're getting is typically lower. If you're an office jurisdiction, weekday is higher, weekend is slow. Ideally, you're in a mixed environment where you're firing on all cylinders and you're appealing to the widest possible customer base.
I have a question for you about developers. How can you entice developers to put in retail, appropriate retail? Our situation where I live on Queens Quay, I'm from York Quay Neighborhood Association, we have tremendous density. But if I need a pair of socks, I have to go up to Dundas Street. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. And we talk to all the developers, we tell them what we need, what we want, and it's unchanged.
Yeah.